In this lecture about the northern colonies in the 17th century, you are going to learn about the Pilgrims, Plymouth, the Puritans, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
The religious roots of the Puritans who founded New England reach back to the Protestant Reformation. As you learned earlier, English King Henry VIII understood that the Reformation offered him an opportunity to break with Rome and take control of the church in England. In 1534, the king persuaded Parliament to outlaw the Catholic Church in England and proclaim the king the only supreme head of the Church of England. The English Reformation divided the country's people. Some wanted to remain Catholic, while others sought a more genuine Reformation. Those who favored a more genuine comprehensive Reformation came to be called Puritans. The term Puritan began as an insult, and its recipients usually referred to each other as the godly, if they used a specific term at all. The Puritans borrowed their doctrine from Christian doctrine of the Swiss Protestant John Calvin. In Calvinism, the chief tenet was predestination, the idea that God determined which human soul will receive eternal salvation. Predestination was the chief tenet of Puritanism as well, and according to this doctrine, God determined whether individuals were destined for salvation or damnation before their birth. Thus, there was nothing an individual did in his or her lifetime that could alter their fate. Moreover, Puritans believed that church membership was only for those who could demonstrate they were saved. Puritans believed that salvation was a free gift from God, and that human beings could not force God's hand. Individuals could only prepare for grace by reading and studying the Bible, so they will understand God's plan and live the best lives they could. Because they were never certain of salvation, many Puritans lived with anxiety. Puritans rejected the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, maintaining that the relationship between God and humanity should be direct. Because every person had direct access to God through the Bible, Puritans promoted literacy and translated the Bible into modern languages. As a result, Puritans, both male and female, were highly literate. Puritans sought to purify the Church of England of all practices related to Catholicism, advocating a simpler worship service, the abolition of ornate churches, and other reforms. They had some success in pushing the Church of England in a more Calvinist direction under King James I. But with the coronation of King Charles I, the Puritans gained a foe that cast English Puritans as excessive and dangerous. Charles I rejected the idea of Puritan reformers and moved the Church of England away from Puritanism. The aggressive anti-Puritan policies of Charles I compelled many Puritans to immigrate outside of England. The largest number set out for America. One of the earliest Puritan groups to immigrate from England, later known as Pilgrims, promoted the idea of separatism. They sought to withdraw and separate from the Church of England, which they considered hopelessly corrupt. When we think of the Pilgrims, it's easy to only think of them as people who wore funny hats, as displayed here. And we often cannot think about the Pilgrims without thinking about Thanksgiving. However, there's more to their history in North America than Thanksgiving. After they gave up hope to reform the Church of England, the Pilgrims moved to Holland, thinking they would be better. But in Holland, they found their children seduced by the manifold temptations of the place. In 1620, the Virginia Company offered them land, and they soon filled two ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The Pilgrims had obtained permission to settle in the extensive lands granted to the Virginia Company, but instead landed in present-day Massachusetts in 1620. Understanding that they had been driven out of course and that their original charter was no longer valid, the Pilgrims drew up the Mayflower Compact, a document to provide order and security in their new colony. The Mayflower Compact was signed by the men aboard the Mayflower. In the document, they bound themselves into a civil body politic to make laws and govern, and to give the authority to the governor, William Bedford. By design, the document excluded those who were not saints or Puritans from the body of politics. Visible saints were Puritans who had passed the test of conversion and church membership and were therefore thought to be among God's elect. Only God knew the identity of the elect or saints, but Puritans believed that if an individual were among the elect, then that person's behavior would surely reflect his or her special status. The connection between sainthood and saintly behavior was far from certain, and members of Puritan churches hoped that they were among God's elect and tried to act as though they were, all the time. With the Mayflower Compact in place, and with William Bedford as their leader, they set forward to settle the Plymouth colony. They established Plymouth on the site of an abandoned Indian village, whose fields had been cleared before an epidemic and were ready for cultivation. It was so recently that this disease had taken over the Patuxet tribe that when the Pilgrims arrived, they were able to obtain some of the leftover grain supplies left in the deserted villages. The Pilgrims were so surprised at their good fortune that Bradford exclaimed upon their arrival, "The good hand of God at work. sweeping away great multitudes of natives that he might make room for us. Unfortunately for the Pilgrims, they had arrived 6 weeks before winter without food or farm animals. More than half of the original Pilgrims died that winter. In the spring, nearby Wampanoag Indians rescued the floundering colony from starvation. The next fall, the Pilgrims feasted to give thanks. We have primary sources, more notably Mart's Relation, a journal of the Pilgrims at Plymouth, that explains this feast, but the details are a bit obscured. Now, one of the most common misconceptions regarding the relationship between Native Americans and the Pilgrims is that they were incredibly nice to one another and that they were best friends forever after the Wampanoags saved the Pilgrims that spring. But we have to remember that the Pilgrims initially decided to establish good diplomatic relations with the local Native Americans because they were in desperate need of help, and the natives ultimately helped them from starvation. Moreover, we also have to remember that by the time the Pilgrims arrived, the Native American tribes in and around Plymouth were in a transitional period, recently having survived a major epidemic that decimated most of their population. Before the Pilgrims' arrival, for example, there were nearly 2,000 Patuxets, Native Americans. However, some fishermen and tradesmen introduced fatal diseases, possibly hepatitis, that killed 90% of the population. Feeling vulnerable, the local natives felt that perhaps they would be better off if they created a trade alliance with the new English arrivals. Squanto, a Patuxet, was instrumental in forming the alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags. Before the Pilgrims arrived in Plymouth, Squanto had been kidnapped by some Europeans and had spent some time in Europe. Upon his return, he discovered his tribe nearly extinct. The once powerful remaining Patuxet now had to pay tribute to the more powerful Narragansetts. Squanto persuaded the chief of the Wanapong, Massasoit, to make an alliance with the newly arrived Pilgrims to perhaps help them in alliance against the Narragansetts. Squanto not only helped the Pilgrims make an alliance with the Wanapong, but he also taught them how to plant corn. Squanto died in 1622, and unknowingly he helped secure the future of the Pilgrims. But this relationship between the settlers and natives will be short-lived. As more and more settlers come to the region, tensions between the settlers and the local natives will continue to rise, ultimately ending in one of the most brutal wars in all colonial America. In 1629, a group of Puritans in England obtained a royal charter for the Massachusetts Bay Company that provided the usual privileges granted to the joint stock companies, including land for colonization that spanned present-day Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. In addition, the charter allowed the government of the company to be located in the colony rather than in England, making the Puritans self-governing. The Puritans, unlike the small band of separatists, the Pilgrims who founded Plymouth Colony in 1620, remained committed to reforming the Church of England, but temporarily left to North America to accomplish this task. The stockholders of the Massachusetts Bay Company elected John Winthrop, a prosperous lawyer and landowner, to serve as governor. On their way to America, Winthrop gave a famous sermon while aboard the ship Arabella. On the sermon, Winthrop explained to his fellow Puritans the cosmic significance of their journey, introducing the concept of America as a city up on a hill. On the sermon, he states in part, "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So, as if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." According to the sermon, they were not separating from or abandoning England, but were rather forming a godly community in America that will be an example for reformers back home. This vision of the colony's significance profoundly shaped 17th century New England. Between 1630 and 1640, more than 20,000 new Puritan settlers came, enthused by Winthrop's vision of a city on a hill. Moreover, his sermon of a city upon a hill and the notion that we shall be an example to follow has been subject of inspiration for other leaders and has been quoted numerous times by numerous presidents of the United States throughout our history. New England immigrants tended to come from the middle ranks of English society. In contrast to the southern colonies, where women and children were rare, New England immigrants usually came as families. Puritans considered each family a little commonwealth that mirrored the hierarchy among all God's creatures and believed New England's social order was defined by the interlocking institutions of family, church, and community. Most New England immigrants were small landholders in England, a class contemporary English called the middling sort. When they arrived in New England, they tended to replicate their home environments, founding towns composed of independent landholders. The New England climate and soil made large-scale plantation agriculture impractical, so the system of large landholders using masses of slaves or indentured servants to grow labor-intensive crops never took hold in New England. Although immigrants to New England expected economic profit, religious motives directed the rhetoric and much of the reality of these colonies. Not every English person who moved to New England during the 17th century was a Puritan, but Puritans dominated the politics, religion, and culture of New England. Even after 1700, the region's Puritan inheritance shaped many aspects of its history. Despite popular belief, the Puritans did not seek to create a heaven of religious toleration, a notion that they, along with nearly all European Christians, regard as ridiculous at best and dangerous at worst. Thus, the Northern Colonies will be a colony controlled by Puritans for Puritans. To Puritans, the church was composed of men and women who had entered a solemn covenant with one another and with God. As discussed earlier, Puritans believed in predestination, and just like in Plymouth, Episcopal saints will lead the church and the political affairs of the colony. The charter of the Massachusetts Bay Company empowered the company's stockholders to meet as a body known as the General Court and make laws needed to govern the company's affairs. As New England Puritans set out to build their utopia by creating communities of the godly, groups of men, often from the same region of England, applied to the colony's general courts for land grants. Unlike the southern colonies, land was more equally distributed in New England. Once town founders obtained a grant, they appointed land among themselves and any newcomers they approved. They generally divided part of the land for immediate use while keeping much of the rest as commons or undivided land for future generations. The town's inhabitants collectively decided the size of each settler's home lot based on their current wealth and status. Besides oversight of property, the town restricted membership, and new arrivals needed to apply for admission. Upon their founding, each town wrote covenants reflecting the Puritan belief in God's covenant with His people. Moreover, the physical layout of New England towns encouraged settlers to look inward towards their neighbors, multiplying the opportunities for godly vigilance. Although by many measures colonization in New England succeeded, its Puritan leaders failed in their own mission to create a utopian community that will inspire their fellows back home in New England. Almost from the beginning, Winthrop and other leaders had difficulty enforcing their views of Puritan orthodoxy. The Puritans' emphasis on individual Bible study led New Englanders towards different visions of godliness. Roger Williams will be one of the first settlers in Massachusetts to break away from the church. He believed that taking the land away from the natives, for example, was wrong, and making everyone attend church was wrong. He was eventually banished in 1636, and he founded Rhode Island. After banishing Roger Williams for his extreme and dangerous opinions, Winthrop confronted another dissenter. Anne Hutchinson, a devout Puritan woman who held weekly lectures in her home. Hutchinson lectured on the covenant of grace, the idea that individuals could be saved only by God's grace in choosing them to be members of the elect. This familiar Puritan doctrine contrasted with the covenant of works, the idea that a person's behavior could win God's favor and lead to salvation. Soon, Hutchinson gained a following, and the meetings in Anne Hutchinson's house alarmed Governor Winthrop, who believed that she was subverting the good order of the colony. Winthrop and other Puritan elders referred to Hutchinson and her followers as antinomians, people who believed that Christians could be saved by faith alone and did not need to act in accordance with God's law as set forth in the Bible and as interpreted by the colony's leaders. The elders finally accused Hutchinson of the heresy of prophecy, the view that God revealed His will directly to a believer instead of exclusively through the Bible, and in 1638 she was formally excommunicated. She and her followers were later killed by Native Americans. The strains within Puritanism, exemplified by the ideas and faiths of Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, caused communities to splinter repeatedly during the 17th century. Disputes between King Charles I and the Puritan-dominated Parliament escalated in 1642 to a civil war in England, known as the Puritan Revolution. Parliamentary forces were victorious, executing Charles I and proclaiming England a Puritan republic. When the Puritan Revolution began, the stream of immigrants to New England dwindled to a trickle, creating hard times for the colonists. And fewer boats to New England meant fewer customers for the colonists' own products and sky-high prices for scarce English goods. New England therefore had to find new products and markets, thereby establishing the enduring patterns of New England's economy. During this period, fish became New England's most important export, followed also by timber and shipbuilding. Although immigration came to a standstill in the 1640s, the population continued to boom in the northern colonies, doubling every 20 years through natural increase. The increase in population numbers did not also hold true for church membership. During this period, many children of the visible saints did not experience conversion and failed to attain full church membership. In 1622, a synod of Massachusetts ministers established the halfway covenant, which permitted the unconverted children of saints to become halfway church members. These halfway members could baptize their infant children, but could not participate in communion and did not have the voting privileges of church membership. On the next lecture, you will continue to learn more about the northern colonies during the 17th century.